program tonight about the Owyhee Canyon lands. But first, let me just give you a little background information on Bonnie, who will be giving the presentation tonight. I found out she's a third-generation Oregonian from the Springfield area, so that gives you like extra bonus points. And worked with her father on a survey crew during the summers as a youth. Starting in 1989, Mike Quigley introduced her to running rivers in an inflatable kayak, using rivers as a highway into the wild. She found these experiences so inspiring, she began keeping a journal about each adventure on every river. From '89 on, they became a self-supported river party of two. So I'm very excited to have Bonnie here tonight. Thank you all for coming, and I will just immediately hand it over to her for a great presentation. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Courtney.
Welcome, Yamhill County, to another episode of Literally Literary. I'm your host, Caroline O'Brien, and this is Bonnie Olin, who is the author of the Owhyee River Journals. And she has come to McMinnville to the Carnegie Room to talk about her book and her experiences growing up in Oregon. Bonnie, welcome to Literally Literary.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about being an Oregon resident and growing up? You were born in Oregon.
I was born in Oregon. My father was born in Oregon. He was first generation Scandinavian and worked in the woods. And I was born and raised in Springfield, Oregon. So I was pretty much a lifelong resident through high school.
Really? Where did you graduate high school?
Springfield High School. When?
When?
1969.
Oh my. So tell us about your experiences growing up in Oregon and how you came to be kind of an observer of the natural world around you.
Well, my dad was a timber cruiser and road surveyor, and he was also an artist, and he spent his winter months when he couldn't work out in the woods painting, and it was painting and drawing and always in the living room as we were growing up. And so he had a keen eye for detail, and he often brought home things from the woods to my mother, and knew the names of things, would point out things to us as children. And so I really think a lot of that love for the outdoors as well as for life in all of its forms really came from him.
So was he kind of a naturalist painter, more of the outdoors and landscapes, or was it specifically creatures of the outdoors?
It wasn't animals, it was landscapes. He painted what he knew of the woods and the flora of the forest. And then he also drew. He thought of himself as an illustrator. He drew a lot of the livelihood of the people who worked out in the woods, and what their lives might have been like, what their jobs were. A lot of detail about both their equipment, their personal gear, and also their relationships. And both my parents felt it was important for us to see a lot of the natural world, the national parks. They took us to all or many of the national parks on the west particularly. But then I had a natural wanderlust as well, and I went to Europe the first time when I was 17, and then a round the world trip when I was 30. And I spent about 5 months, $5,000, and came home with $600. And my letters at home, to home, my mother kept. I was always detail oriented. I liked writing about what I saw and what I was observing, whether it was the life of people or animal. The natural world in particularly was a big draw. Was fascinated with, and so I recorded those things, and I spent a lot of time recording that information, and I found I loved it.
So it's kind of an epistolatory travel log of your own, of where you've been and what you saw.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
What do you remember, perchance, the first time your parents took you to a state park? How old were you?
Oh, You know, I can't remember. I'm not sure if it's my memory that I remember, a true memory, or my dad purchased an 8mm camera in 1948 and began making movies. And he felt it was important. And so some of those memories I have are really embedded in film, and that I've seen them so many times. But one of the first memories was about 5 years old. We're at Sequoia National Park, and the images of those wonderfully large trees, Yellowstone, about the same age. So I haven't a great memory of that time period because I was so young, and most of it is in film that I recollect it from.
So when did you sort of, I mean, obviously there was a transition there from being young and traveling and then growing up. At what point did you start collecting these pictures and notations and thinking, I have a book here? What happened? What was that process?
What was that process? Actually, I was in the OWYHEE country. I began journaling my trips into the rivers, on the rivers. I credit my husband with those opportunities. And it was the first time that how do I want to say it? I had no restrictions on my time. I didn't have to report to the office. I was 8 or 9 or 10 days in the wild without having to answer to anything but to nature. You know, eat when you're hungry. And I found nature extremely compelling. These trips were so amazing that I was compelled to write about them. I could not write about them. And over time, the journals were shared between family and friends, and then to a wider audience, and I was encouraged to publish them, but I didn't know if they'd stand on their own. And I thought, well, probably the best thing to do if I was going to publish about the Owhyee, because everybody thinks of the Owhyee as their secret, that they really needed an abundance of pictures, and it would be with the purpose of helping to conserve the area, that I would publish this book. So I was really laying out on the ground and looking up at the stars in the Owhyee one night when I just thought, I think this is something I want to try to do. I mean, and it wasn't that long ago. And it's been a wonderful process. It's been a wonderful journey.
So you experienced what people call a vocation, a voice just
That's right.
speaking to you.
Yeah. I think after retirement also, you have an opportunity to explore the things that you've always loved doing. Music was also a really big part of my life in my youth. But music and theater, while I dabbled in it, I thought I couldn't make a living at it. And very much the same thing with writing. You know, I never thought that I had what it took to make the sacrifices that one might be making to actually be able to support myself. It's tough, I think. So I have a lot of admiration for people who are so called to do these things. They do them at a very young age.
So Bonnie, as an amateur naturalist, I mean, obviously, you've said you've had this vocation. I mean, it spoke to you to want to write this down. Were you influenced by other writers and John Muir and Rachel Carson, and even some of the great writers of adventure books, Jack London? I mean, they talk about what it was like. What were your influences as far as authors?
Well, I'm really drawn to nonfiction. And one book in particular in Death Valley, it's called Death Valley in 49. I can't think of the author's name right off the top of my head, but stories of people that are based on their actual experiences. So that's one. Another one is Astoria by Peter Stark. I think for people in the Pacific Northwest particularly, but really throughout our country, I think that should be required reading. It is beautifully put forth the story of the two expeditions, one overland and one around the Horn, to reach the city of Astoria here in Oregon, and the hardships of the individuals involved. And there were women in these groups. The same with the Death Valley in '49. I think the readers would be amazed at the resiliency of the people in these stories. A more contemporary book would be The Emerald Mile by Kevin Fedarko, and he brings together beautifully the stories of both environmentalism, of civil engineering, hydrology, river runners, and so much more, and weaves them into a really compelling narrative about today and our rivers and the importance of our natural landscapes to the human spirit as well. Those are the first few that I can think of right off the top of my head.
Kind of tell us a little bit about the OWYHEE, maybe 5 touch points about the OWYHEE, and then sort of tell us how you came about to write this down. What led you into putting it into book form?
Well, the OWYHEE is an area conjoined by 3 states, Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada. It's known as I Own Country as one of its acronyms. It's also known as the Big Quiet. It's about 9 million acres. That's roughly the size of the 2 states of Maryland and Rhode Island together. It's largely roadless. And I like to tell people they won't find themselves there on their way to anywhere else. You have to want to go there. My husband, Mike Quigley, introduced me to the OWYHEE in 1993. He had been exploring the area since the 70s. We went into the upper regions of the Canyonlands. It is truly an expedition just getting into the area, and it was one of 2 or 3 really multi-day trips of 8, 9, 10 days long that I had taken at that time. It was probably a little bit bigger than I could bite off that first trip, but we survived it, but learned from our mistakes, and I kept a journal from that first trip and almost every one since that time. It is such a compelling environment. I had been to, as I'd mentioned, many of the national parks, and it is unlike any other geology in the continental U.S. It's stunning country.
Bonnie, I noticed you have this little map here where you sort of, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and it talks about the track with the hot spots. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about this hot spot?
Yeah, the OWYHEE Canyonlands were born about 15 million years ago. There was a huge volcanic eruptions. They eventually dammed up the drainages, and ancient Lake Idaho was formed. And then about 1 million years ago, the dam broke and the drainages started being worked through by water and by wind, and these canyons began to form. But that volcanic activity is a result of what they call Yellowstone hotspots. And at that time, 15 to 16 million years ago, the hotspots that underlay Yellowstone National Park right now were in the area of McDermott, Nevada, which is in the OWYHEE region. And then the chart will show the individual how it has moved over millennium to where it is now.
Can you tell us just a little bit about how you came to write this book, what brought you into that process, and how it became a book?
Well, as I had mentioned earlier, I had been encouraged by individuals outside of family to publish these journals. I was afraid to do so, but thought, well, I'll give it a try, and I just began doing a lot of research on self-publishing, actually, and I also, though, before I made the decision to self-publish, I went ahead and reached out to about 4, 5, 6 publishers about the possibility of producing these books through a legitimate publishing firm. And from all of them, I got back the same answer, but from 2 of them in particularly was an interesting answer. All of them said the OWYHEE is not well known enough to warrant a larger publishing firm to produce this work, because they indicated you needed to at least have a run of 3,000 books or more to make it economically viable. And they are a business, so that I can understand. But 2 of the publishers came back to me and said that I had done such a beautiful job of I did a prototype of my book and had kind of designed the layout and put the writing together, with the photographs, and said this is what it might look like. And I had presented that to these publishers. And they both encouraged me to go ahead and self-publish, because the market was small, but they felt it was a good project. And so that really gave me the courage, I guess, to go forward.
In this process of creating it, was it kind of like a book proposal then of what chapter would be where and how you were going to present it? Or the layout really of what it would appear, the exterior, the cover, etc., and how you were going to present the information?
The proposal actually, every publisher has a series of questions they ask the author, and so I went through the normal process of answering those questions. But in addition, they would ask, how do you see this book? How would this, what would it look like? What is it that you have in mind? And so I had mentioned that the journals, it would be a writing of record, combined with images of the OWYHEE Canyonlands. And I actually did a single print on demand book to give them a visual example of what that might look like.
Can you tell us just a little bit about your DVD that is available with your book?
Yes. At many of my presentations over the last 3 years, people have asked me if I would sell my movie. And I hadn't really considered it, but I've been asked that question enough times that I went ahead and had the presentation movie produced along with the slideshow, which is fairly new. The slideshow actually encompasses the entire OWYHEE region, from Nevada to the Oregon Owhyhee Reservoir, because I wanted people to see it as a region. And then the movie is of an expedition into the upper regions of the Owhyhee. It's a 8-day long expedition. Movie's about 20 minutes long, and I put them together on one DVD, and I think I've priced it well enough to encourage people to maybe pick one up, because the whole idea behind all of this is to show them what the OWYHEE looks like, and perhaps they'll care about the conservation work that's going on there.
Do you have a website?
I do. It is www.owhyheemedia.com. We put in on Deep Creek at Brace Crossing and paddled a couple hours to the confluence with Dick Shooter Creek, where we set up camp. The following morning we climbed up out of the canyon for a hike along the rim of Dick Shooter, with views of Deep Creek to the south and Dick Shooter to the north. About an hour into our hike, as we approached the rim of the canyon, we spotted a herd of California bighorn sheep. Several smaller drainages flow into Dick Shooter Creek about midway. The confluence of these drainages has carved out a labyrinth of steep-walled corridors, peninsulas, and islands in the sky, providing an ideal habitat for the sheep. We continued our hike east along the rim and spotted the same herd again, and so we watched until they disappeared from view. We followed another drainage flowing in from the south, which would take us to the bottom of the canyon for some additional exploration. Despite the now hot air temperature, the creek water was icy cold, but it was refreshing too, and coupled with a little snack, we felt ready for the long return hike. Along the creek bottom, the common larkspur was still in bloom, seen here among some wild mint. While up on the plateau we found bitterroot, rough daisy or perhaps aster, linear leaf daisy or possibly Oregon sunshine. Day 3. We took our time today, not that you could speed along. Deep Creek is just barely navigable, slow-moving with many exposed rocks and a few passages choked by willows. But we wanted to enjoy this short river and stopped many times to take pictures. One of our stops also included exploring this slot canyon, which was a fun diversion from the morning's paddle. We are traveling at an approximate rate of 2 miles per hour, so after 6 hours on the river we had covered only about 10 miles, but decided to set up camp as the little weather was moving in. The short remaining 2 miles on Deep Creek took us an hour and a half. The river was filled with many small boulders, and the shallow waters caused us to hang up on rocks many times. By the time we reached the confluence with the East Fork, it was a real treat to have the increased flow. Rockfall Rapid is a short Class 3 rapid, which appears to be totally blocked, but there is a narrow passage, seen here on River Right, which we will run. Now past the rapid, we enter Lambert's Gorge, a beautiful sheer-wall narrow canyon. It is an afternoon without wind, and we enjoy a silent float. It was already 3 p.m., and we had been 6 hours on the river. The portage around Owhyhee Falls lay ahead, so we decided to make camp above the falls and tackle the difficult portage in the morning. As we were settling in for the afternoon, a banded racing pigeon flew into camp. We now had a camp mascot, and he followed us everywhere. We named him Petey. He kept himself busy checking out gear in search of food and making himself lovable. Petey hung around camp for a couple hours, finally making do with some ground-up granola for his dinner, and then flew away.
Not very hungry, I guess. Well, he doesn't like bagels.
After dinner, Mike explored the slopes at the base of the cliffs across river, while I wrote of the day's events in my journal, and then we called it a day. Now on our 5th day, and the really hard work begins. The official portage around Owhyhee Falls begins from our camp. It's a 1/4 mile long and climbs 500 feet above the river. We completed the portage in 3 trips and just under 3 grueling hours. The 2 portages on the East Fork are what keep the river so isolated from other river runners, and that's the only positive comment we can make regarding this Herculean effort. It's a relief to have this portage over with, and yet, just a few miles downstream, we'll encounter Thread the Needle, another portage, or possibly, if we're lucky, we can line it. We ran the short Class 3 rapid leading into Thread the Needle, eddied out on River Right, and made preparations for lining around the blockage. But we had a mishap while lining the first IK and lost our grip on the kayak. Our attention was now turned to securing gear, which we recovered a short distance downstream, but it left me without video of this event. Tired from the day's ordeal, we quickly made camp. We lingered in camp this morning, as did our neighbors downstream. These river otter were not concerned about us, and spent the entire morning grooming each other. The otter were a good omen. It was as if they said, "If yesterday was your hardest day on the river, then today will be your most idyllic." We glided down the river, through silent canyons with barely a whisper of wind. Past cave swallows that swooped from their nests, warding off hawks. And gravel bars covered with lupin and purple sage. This section of the river canyon is a mass of rhyolite formations, hoodoos, and spires, and we found a wonderful sand beach camp right in the heart of it. I had the perfect tree for our sun shower, but this rattlesnake had already claimed it, so we opted to bathe in the river instead, forfeiting property rights to the original owner. As darkness fell upon the canyon, the bats appeared, and I watched as they skimmed the surface of the glassy water. It was a fitting end to a perfect day. The next morning we paddled for about 2 hours before coming on what remains of Beaver Charlie's cabin. This cabin signals that the Class 4 Cabin Rapids is just ahead. On the upper section of the rapid, the boater is faced with a series of enormous boulders that block the view downstream. The river is just low enough that normal passage on the left is blocked, so Mike paddles to the opposite shore to scout for an alternate passage. And finds one with just enough room for us to squeeze through. The second section of the rapid is the most difficult, both technically and because it forms an S-turn nearly 1/2 mile long. Mike's about a third of the way down and tucks into an eddy so he can take some pictures of me coming through. This is Cable Rapid, and we usually portage it, but with the low water we think we can line it. So I'm going to push Mike out here and push his kayak out here in a minute, and then he's going to get out there on a rock and take it through a slot. We camped several miles downstream from Cable Rapids, sharing our camp with the burrow of this western fence lizard. We were so anxious to have the portage at Cable Rapids over with, and tired from the long run at Cabin Rapids, that I forgot to film our last portage. Our 8th and last day on the river began quietly. About an hour downstream, we came to the abandoned homestead at 5 Bar. Evidence of ranch life can be found everywhere upon the bench, such as this tack room. The remains of this old wagon and cedar irrigation pipes. And a blacksmith shop. A few miles below 5 Bar is an ancient rock shelter whose opening forms a nearly perfect arch. From here on down, there are many quiet stretches on the river. 4 hours later, we reach a site we have paddled 8 days to enjoy, the warm waters of Tudor Warm Springs. Thousands of gallons of water seep out of the rocks in this drainage to form a large creek, which spills into several pools before falling into the river. And it doesn't take us long to climb the cliffs to soak those tired muscles. As we left the springs to paddle the last mile and a half to the takeout, a thunderstorm passed over us but quickly moved on. In the past 8 days, we had viewed landscapes that only a few will ever see, delighted in all that was around us, tested the limits of our endurance, and were humbled by our limitations. And just as Buzz Holstrom wrote in his Colorado River Journal that he found his reward in the doing of the thing, so have we.